I'll never forget the morning of April 12, 1945, when I first walked into that German POW compound at Camp Shelby, Mississippi. The smell of bacon and fresh coffee was drifting from our mess hall, mixed with the sweet scent of magnolia blossoms that bloomed everywhere across the base. I could hear Bing Crosby's White Christmas crackling through someone's radio in the distance, competing with the sound of mockingbirds singing their hearts out like the war was already over. Spring was just breaking over the pine forests of southern Mississippi, and the morning air was thick with humidity and the promise of another scorching day. I was Sergeant First Class Frank Tank Morrison, 3rd Armored Division, and after 18 months of combat from the beaches of Normandy to the bridges of Remagen, I thought I'd seen everything this war could throw at me. Sherman tanks burning in French hedgerows, artillery barrages that shook the earth for miles, frozen foxholes in the Ardennes where men died of cold before they could die of bullets. I'd been through it all. The nickname Tank didn't come from my size, though I was a solid 6'2" and 200 pounds of Mississippi muscle. It came from the fact that I'd kept my Sherman running through more battles than most crews survived, from Operation Cobra all the way to the final push into Germany. But what I witnessed in those wooden barracks over the next 2 months would shake me to my core and change everything I thought I knew about our enemies, about war, and about what it truly means to be an American. The brass had pulled me off the line in March, right after we crossed the Rhine at Remagen. I'd been sitting in my tank, cleaning the breech of our 75mm gun, when Captain Williams appeared at the hatch. He was a thin, bookish man from Boston, with wire-rimmed glasses that were always sliding down his nose, but he'd earned every man's respect by leading from the front for 2 years. "Morrison," he'd said, adjusting those glasses, "you've done your time in the mud. 18 months of combat, 2 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star. The Army's got a new assignment for you." He paused, lighting a lucky strike with hands that still shook slightly from shell shock. "We need someone reliable to run POW operations back stateside. Someone who understands soldiers, who won't lose his head when things get complicated. I'll admit, after watching too many good men get cut down by German machine guns, after seeing entire tank crews burned alive in their steel coffins, the idea of guard duty in Mississippi sounded like a vacation. No more German 88s screaming overhead. No more digging frozen foxholes. No more watching 19-year-old kids from Kansas bleed out in the mud calling for their mothers. Just peace, quiet, and the slow drawl of home. But when I stepped through those barbed wire gates that first morning at Camp Shelby, nothing could have prepared me for what I saw. 1,200 German soldiers sat in neat rows on wooden benches outside their barracks, their field grey uniforms faded and patched, waiting for morning chow call. These weren't the fierce Wehrmacht troops I'd faced across the bocage of Normandy, those men who'd fought us building by building through Caen and Saint-Vith. These were hollow-eyed men, some barely out of their teens with peach fuzz on their cheeks, others old enough to be my father, with grey threading through their hair. Their uniforms hung loose on gaunt frames, and I could see their ribs through torn shirts. Many had lost 20, 30, even 40 pounds. Their boots were held together with wire and tape, their equipment long since discarded or destroyed. But what struck me most was their eyes. They watched our every move with a mixture of fear and desperate hope I'd never seen before, not even from our own wounded. These weren't the hard, fanatical stares of SS troops or the resigned exhaustion of regular Wehrmacht. This was something else entirely, a kind of stunned disbelief that they were alive, that they were safe, that the killing had finally stopped. My job was simple in theory but massive in scope: oversee food distribution for the entire compound. The Army had assigned me 4 mess sergeants: Cookie Williams from Alabama, Big Mike Kowalski from Detroit, Tony Ricci from Brooklyn, and Samuel Sam Johnson from Georgia, plus a dozen KPs to feed this small city of prisoners 3 squares a day. Standard military rations, nothing fancy, just good, solid American chow. But after what these boys had been eating in those final months of the war, our regular mess hall food was going to seem like a feast from the gods themselves. The compound was laid out like any army base, with wooden barracks arranged in neat rows, a central mess hall that could seat 400 men at a time, recreation areas with volleyball nets and makeshift soccer fields, and even a small library where German-speaking chaplains held services. The whole place was surrounded by double rows of barbed wire, with guard towers every 50 yards manned by MPs with Thompson submachine guns. But the atmosphere wasn't threatening. It felt more like a refugee camp than a prison. Let me paint you a picture of what daily life was like back then at Camp Shelby. Reveille sounded at 0530 hours, just like any army base, and by 0600, the entire compound was awake and moving. The prisoners had organized themselves just like any military unit. They had their own NCOs, maintained strict discipline, kept their barracks spotless with hospital corners on every bunk and floors you could eat off of. They'd even set up their own internal mail system and published a weekly newsletter in German that our intelligence officers monitored but never censored. Their senior man was Obergefreiter Klaus Richter, a tank commander from the 12th SS Panzer Division who'd been captured during the final German offensive in the Ardennes, what we called the Battle of the Bulge. He was tall, maybe 6'4", blonde hair going grey at the temples, with pale blue eyes and a wicked scar running down his left cheek from a piece of Allied shrapnel that had nearly taken his eye. He spoke perfect English with just a trace of accent, the kind of precise pronunciation that suggested university education before the war had claimed his youth. "Sergeant Morrison," he said that first morning, standing at rigid attention as I approached the mess line, boots polished despite their condition, uniform pressed as well as rags could be pressed. "I wish to thank you and your men for the proper treatment of my soldiers. We had heard stories, but you have shown us the honor that exists between fighting men." Now, I'd been expecting sullen resistance, maybe some Nazi fanaticism, definitely some resentment about losing the war. What I got was military courtesy and genuine gratitude that caught me completely off guard. These weren't the monsters our propaganda had painted. They were soldiers, just like us, who'd happened to be born on the wrong side of the Atlantic Ocean and caught up in something bigger than any one man could control. Klaus had fought on the Eastern Front for 2 years before being transferred west. He'd seen things in Russia that he wouldn't talk about, even months later when we'd become something approaching friends. All he'd say was, "Sergeant Morrison, there are experiences that change a man forever." The Russian front was hell itself, but not because of the Russians, because of what we became out there. The first breakfast was something I'll never forget as long as I live. Our cooks had prepared the usual army fare: scrambled powdered eggs reconstituted with real milk and butter, thick slices of bacon that crackled with grease, toast made from actual white bread with honest-to-God butter, hash browns cooked in bacon fat, coffee with sugar and real cream from the PX, and even some grits that Cookie Williams insisted on adding because these boys need to experience proper Southern cooking. Nothing special by American standards. Hell, it was probably better food than half our own GIs got in the field, but standard for rear echelon troops. But when those prisoners filed through the chow line and saw the portions we were dishing out, saw Cookie Williams filling their metal trays with enough food for 3 men, you could have heard a pin drop in that cavernous mess hall. The silence was so profound that even the kitchen staff stopped clattering pans to listen. I watched Hans Kruger, a 19-year-old kid from a farm outside Munich, stop dead in his tracks when Cookie Williams plopped a full serving spoon of eggs on his tray, enough scrambled eggs to feed a family. The boy's hands started shaking so violently, he nearly dropped his tray and tears began streaming down his face, cutting clean tracks through the grime and exhaustion. He turned to his buddy next to him, Wilhelm Hoffmann from Hamburg, and whispered in German. I'd picked up enough of the language during my time overseas to understand most conversations. "Wilhelm," he said, voice cracking like he was 12 instead of 19. "There's enough food here for 3 men, maybe 4. Wilhelm, a 22-year-old who'd been a university student before the war drafted him into the Luftwaffe ground forces, just stared at his tray and nodded slowly. His own hands were trembling as he looked at bacon. Real bacon. Thick strips of it. Not the sawdust extended ersatz meat they'd been eating in Germany. "Hans," he whispered back, "in the last 6 months, I've been living on turnip soup and black bread that was more sawdust than flour. Sometimes not even that. Some days just hot water with a few potato peelings if we were lucky." The ripple effect spread through the mess hall like wildfire. Men began speaking in hushed, reverent tones, pointing at their trays like they contained the Holy Grail itself. Some were crying openly. Others just stood there in shock, unable to process what they were seeing. A few of the older prisoners, NCOs who'd maintained discipline through hell itself, had to sit down because their legs wouldn't support them anymore. Klaus Richter, maintaining his bearing as senior prisoner, walked through the line with military precision, but I could see his Adam's apple working as he swallowed hard, fighting his own emotions. When Cookie Williams asked him, "How you want your eggs, Fritz?" Using the standard American nickname for German soldiers, Klaus replied with perfect courtesy, "However you see fit to serve them, Sergeant. We are grateful for anything." But the real moment that changed everything, the moment that would haunt and inspire me for the rest of my life, came 3 days later on April 15th, when our supply sergeant, Staff Sergeant Bobby Marlowe from Tennessee, announced that we'd received a shipment of ice cream mix and 2 new electric freezer units, fresh from the Kelvinator factory in Detroit. Now, ice cream was a luxury even for us American GIs. We usually only got it on special occasions like the 4th of July, Christmas, or when supply got particularly generous and someone higher up decided to boost morale. Most of the time, we made do with whatever dessert Cookie could whip up from scratch. Rice pudding, bread pudding if we had stale bread, maybe some canned fruit if we were lucky. But Captain Williams, bless his soul, had made a decision that would echo through the lives of 1,200 men forever. "These prisoners are under American protection now," he'd announced at the morning staff meeting, polishing his glasses with that nervous habit of his. "They'll receive the same treatment as American troops. That means 3 hot meals a day, medical care, recreation time, and yes, that includes dessert when we have it available." Some of the guards grumbled about giving ice cream to Krauts, who'd been shooting at Americans just weeks before, but Captain Williams shut that down fast. "Gentlemen, these men are no longer our enemies. They're our responsibility. We'll treat them with the same dignity we'd want for our own boys if they were captured. That's what separates us from the Nazis." I'll never forget the moment we wheeled that first batch of vanilla ice cream into the mess hall. Cookie Williams and his crew had been working since 400 hours, mixing and freezing about 50 gallons, enough for every prisoner to get a decent scoop, maybe 4 ounces each. The temperature was pushing 85 degrees that afternoon, typical for Mississippi in April, with humidity so thick you could cut it with a bayonet. That ice cream, white and creamy and cold as a mountain stream, looked like salvation itself. The mess hall was arranged with long wooden tables that could seat 8 men each, benches on both sides like a monastery refectory. The prisoners had learned our routine by now. They'd file in by barracks, oldest and senior ranking first, then by age and time in service. Klaus Richter was always first in line, maintaining the dignity of rank even in captivity. When Private Johnson, Sam was a 20-year-old colored soldier from Savannah who'd volunteered for this duty, despite the segregation that still plagued our army, scooped that white, creamy goodness into Klaus's metal bowl, the German tank commander's face went completely white. The color drained from his scarred cheeks like someone had opened a valve, and his pale blue eyes went wide as saucers. His hands trembled as he took the bowl, and he just stood there staring at it like it was made of gold and diamonds. The ice cream was already beginning to melt slightly in the heat, creating small white rivulets that ran down the sides of the bowl, but Klaus couldn't seem to move. "Ice," he whispered in German, then louder, "Ice, ice, ice, ice cream." The word spread through the mess hall like wildfire, men turning to see what their senior NCO was talking about. Within seconds, every conversation had stopped. Every eye was fixed on Klaus Richter and the bowl of vanilla ice cream in his trembling hands. What happened next, I'll remember until the day I die, and probably long after. Every single one of those 1,200 German soldiers stopped whatever they were doing, talking, walking, breathing, and turned to look at their leader. This tough tank commander, who'd fought from the invasion of Poland to the forests of France to the frozen hell of the Eastern Front, sat down at his usual table and took one small spoonful with the care of a man handling sacred relics. He closed his eyes, and I swear on my mother's grave, on the memory of every American boy who died fighting these men, that hardened veteran started crying like a baby. Not quiet tears, not dignified military sobbing, full body-shaking sobs that echoed through the silent mess hall like thunder. "Mein Gott," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, his voice breaking on every word. "My God, I had forgotten this existed. I had forgotten that such things were possible." The ripple effect was immediate and overwhelming. Some of the younger prisoners started sobbing openly, their own ice cream forgotten as they watched their unbreakable leader break down completely. Others sat in stunned silence, eating their ice cream one tiny spoonful at a time, like they were afraid it would disappear if they ate too fast, like it might be a dream that would end if they acknowledged it too enthusiastically. Otto Brenner, a 40-year-old sergeant from Munich who'd been drafted away from his job as a baker, turned to his tablemate with tears streaming down his weathered face. His English was broken, but heartfelt. "My daughter, she is 7 years old, Greta. She has never tasted ice cream, never. She does not know such things exist in the world." Hans Kruger, the 19-year-old farm boy, was crying so hard he could barely speak. "My mother," he gasped between sobs. "She used to make ice cream before the war. Real cream from our cows, snow from the mountains, sugar from the beet harvest. I was 8 years old the last time I tasted it. 8 years old. That's when it hit me like a Sherman tank to the chest, like an 88mm shell exploding in my brain. These men hadn't just been fighting a war, they'd been living in hell for years." While American kids back home were enjoying ice cream sodas at the local pharmacy, while teenagers were sharing milkshakes at drive-in restaurants, while families were gathering around dinner tables with plenty to eat and ice cream for dessert, German children were starving in bombed-out cities. While our families were dealing with rationing and victory gardens and meatless Mondays, entire German cities were surviving on whatever scraps they could find in the rubble. The ice cream distribution that first day took over an hour, because every single prisoner had to stop and process what was happening. Some men sat and stared at their bowls for 10 minutes before taking their first bite. Others ate with such careful, reverent slowness that their ice cream melted into soup before they finished. A few couldn't eat at all. The shock was too much, and they just sat there weeping until their friends had to help them back to their barracks. Wilhelm Hoffmann, the university student from Hamburg, finally managed to take a spoonful, and when the cold sweetness hit his tongue, he actually laughed out loud. A sound so unexpected and joyful that it made several nearby prisoners jump. "It's cold," he announced to no one in particular, his voice full of wonder. "It's actually cold and sweet and—" He paused, searching for words. "It tastes like before the war. It tastes like childhood." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those faces, about grown men crying over ice cream, about children who'd never experienced such simple pleasures. I found myself walking the compound perimeter, listening to the sounds drifting from the barracks. Not the usual complaints or arguments you'd expect from 1,200 homesick soldiers, but quiet conversations, muffled laughter, and what sounded like prayers of gratitude in German. Over the next few weeks, I made it my personal mission to understand these men, to hear their stories and learn what had brought them to this place. During our daily conversations, Klaus told me about the final months of the war from their perspective, and what he shared painted a picture that no American newspaper had ever described. "Sergeant Morrison," he said one evening as we watched the sunset over the Mississippi pines, the air thick with the scent of honeysuckle and the sound of whippoorwills calling from the forest, "you must understand something about Germany in those final months. My unit was the 12th SS Panzer, elite troops, supposedly the best fed and best equipped in the Wehrmacht. But by February, we were down to one meal every 2 days. Turnip soup if we were lucky, sometimes just hot water with a potato and maybe some tree bark for fiber." He paused, lighting one of the Lucky Strike cigarettes we'd given him, another small luxury that had brought tears to his eyes the first time. "My tank crew hadn't seen real meat since Christmas. We were eating horses that had been dead for weeks, rats when we could catch them, anything that would keep us alive another day. And we were the lucky ones. At least we had military rations, however meager. The civilian—" His voice trailed off, and he took a long drag from his cigarette. When he continued, his English was careful and precise, but I could hear the emotion underneath every word. "The civilians were eating wallpaper paste, Sergeant. Wallpaper paste mixed with sawdust and whatever scraps they could find. Leather from old shoes, boiled until it was soft enough to chew. Grass soup, literally grass and water, seasoned with salt if they were fortunate enough to have salt." Wilhelm, the kid from Hamburg, shared stories that would make your blood run cold and break your heart at the same time. His family had been middle class before the war. His father was a teacher. His mother worked in a bookstore. They'd lived in a comfortable apartment near the university. But by 1944, everything had changed. My mother wrote in her last letter, this was January 1945, that she was feeding the family wallpaper paste mixed with sawdust, Wilhelm told me one afternoon as we sat under a shade tree, watching other prisoners play volleyball with equipment the Red Cross had provided. The British bombing destroyed all the food warehouses in Hamburg. The supply trucks couldn't get through because of the Allied fighters. We were eating anything we could find, pigeons, cats, dogs that had been killed in the bombing. He paused, pulling up grass with his fingers, something he did when the memories got particularly painful. My little sister Emma was 12 years old. She weighed maybe 60 pounds by Christmas. 60 pounds, Sergeant. She looked like... He struggled for the English words. Like a skeleton with skin stretched over it. My mother's last letter said Emma had stopped growing, stopped talking. She just sat by the window looking for food trucks that never came. But the ice cream remained the daily miracle that transformed these men from hollow-eyed prisoners into something approaching human beings again. Every afternoon at 1400 hours, right after lunch cleanup and before work detail assignments, we'd wheel out those freezer units, and every single day I watched grown men weep with joy over a simple scoop of vanilla ice cream. Not because it tasted particularly amazing. Hell, it was just standard army-issue ice cream mix, the same stuff we served in mess halls from California to England, but because it represented something they'd forgotten existed: abundance, sweetness, the simple pleasure of a cold treat on a warm day. By late April, we'd established a routine that became sacred to everyone in the compound. The prisoners would form neat lines by barracks, maintaining perfect military discipline. Cookie Williams and his crew would set up the serving station with military precision, metal scoops cleaned and sanitized, bowls stacked and ready, extra portions prepared in case anyone wanted seconds. And yes, there were always seconds available. Captain Williams had made it clear that as long as supplies lasted, no prisoner would be denied ice cream. The transformation in these men over those weeks was nothing short of miraculous. They'd gained weight, 15, 20 pounds in some cases. Their uniforms started fitting better. Their eyes gained life and clarity. And most importantly, they started smiling. Not the bitter, sarcastic smiles of defeated soldiers, but genuine expressions of contentment and hope. One afternoon in late April, I was making my rounds when I overheard a conversation that stopped me cold in my tracks. 3 young prisoners, couldn't have been more than 18 or 19, were sitting under a shade tree savoring their ice cream like it was liquid gold, like every spoonful contained the secrets of the universe. "Franz," one said to his buddy, a thin kid with bright red hair and freckles who'd been captured during the final assault on Berlin, "do you think the stories are true about America?" Franz looked up from his ice cream, considering the question with the seriousness that only teenagers can bring to philosophical discussions. "What stories, Heinrich?" Heinrich glanced around to make sure no guards were listening, then leaned in closer. "That every American family has an icebox in their house. That children drink fresh milk with every meal. That there are stores where you can buy any food you want anytime you want it, without ration cards or queues or," he gestured helplessly, "without anything except money." Franz took another careful spoonful of ice cream before answering, rolling it around his mouth like fine wine, savoring every molecule of sweetness. "After this," he held up his bowl, "after eating 3 meals a day for 3 weeks, after getting seconds when we ask for them, after ice cream every single day, Heinrich, I think maybe those stories aren't so crazy after all." The third boy, Werner Schmidt from a small farm outside Dresden, had been quiet through this exchange, but now he spoke up with the kind of insight that only comes from surviving hell. "My father always told me Americans were soft," he said quietly, "weak, spoiled by easy living. He said they could never understand the strength that comes from struggle, from deprivation, from making do with less." He paused, taking a spoonful of ice cream and closing his eyes as he tasted it. "But to have this much food, to be so wealthy and powerful that you can give ice cream to your enemies every day. Maybe we were wrong about what strength really means. Maybe strength isn't about suffering. Maybe it's about having so much that you can afford to be generous." That conversation haunted me for days, weeks, maybe months. These boys, and they were just boys despite the uniforms and the weapons they'd carried, were starting to understand something that would reshape their entire worldview. American strength didn't come from suffering or deprivation or making do with less. It came from abundance, from a system that produced so much food, so much wealth, so much prosperity that we could afford to feed our enemies ice cream every single day without thinking twice about it. Over the following days and weeks, I started paying closer attention to these conversations, these moments of revelation that seemed to happen every day in the compound. The ice cream distribution became more than just a treat. It became a daily lesson in American values, though none of us realized it at the time. Klaus Richter, being the senior NCO and natural leader, often held informal discussions with groups of prisoners in the evenings after work detail. I'd position myself nearby, ostensibly checking security arrangements, but actually listening to these conversations that were reshaping these men's understanding of America and democracy and capitalism. "The sergeant tells me," Klaus said one evening to a group of about 20 prisoners gathered around him, "that ice cream is common in America. Not special, not reserved for holidays or celebrations. Common. American children eat it regularly, perhaps several times per week." Hans Kruger, who'd become something of a spokesman for the younger prisoners, raised his hand like he was in school. "Obergefreiter, do you believe this is possible?" Klaus considered the question with the seriousness of a philosophy professor. "Hans, 3 months ago, I would have said no. I would have said this was American propaganda, designed to make us think they were richer than they really were." He gestured toward the mess hall. "But every day for 2 weeks, they have given us ice cream. Not once, not twice, but every single day. They have never run out, never made excuses, never reduced the portions. If they can afford to give ice cream to 1,200 prisoners every day, what must life be like for American children?" The question hung in the evening air like tobacco smoke, and I could see these men processing the implications. If America was wealthy enough to treat prisoners this well, what did that say about American families, about American workers, about the entire American system that had produced such abundance? By May, the transformation in the compound was remarkable and visible to anyone who cared to look. The prisoners had gained weight, their uniforms fit better, and there was life in their eyes again. But more importantly, their entire understanding of America, of capitalism, of democracy, had shifted fundamentally. Klaus Richter said it best during one of our evening talks, as we sat on wooden crates behind the mess hall, watching fireflies begin their nightly dance through the pine trees. The air was thick with honeysuckle and the distant sound of prisoners singing German folk songs, not military marches or Nazi anthems, but simple songs about home and family and peace. "Sergeant Morrison," Klaus said, carefully stubbing out his lucky strike on the wooden crate, "I want to tell you something that may surprise you. I have been a soldier for 12 years. I fought in Poland, France, Russia. I have seen the worst that war can bring. Cities destroyed, families torn apart, children orphaned and starving. I have seen what happens when civilized men become animals." He paused, looking out over the compound where his fellow prisoners were playing cards, writing letters home and preparing for evening roll call with the same discipline they'd maintained through 4 years of war. "But never, in all those years of fighting, in all those countries I helped conquer, did any of our officers tell us that American soldiers would feed German prisoners ice cream every day. Never did anyone explain that America was so wealthy, so abundant, that they could afford such generosity to their enemies." He turned to look at me directly, and in the gathering twilight, his pale blue eyes seemed to glow with intensity. "This is not the America we were told about in our briefings. We were told Americans were soft, weak, obsessed with comfort and luxury. But what kind of strength allows a nation to be generous to its enemies? What kind of power can afford daily ice cream for prisoners of war?" The daily ice cream distribution had become a kind of ceremony by this point, something approaching a religious ritual in its precision and reverence. The prisoners would line up in perfect formation, receive their portions with military courtesy and genuine gratitude, and then sit together in small groups, eating slowly and talking quietly about their families, their hopes, their dreams, for when this war was finally over. But it wasn't just about the ice cream anymore. These men had started to understand that the ice cream was a symbol, a daily demonstration of American abundance and generosity that challenged everything they'd been taught about us. They'd been told that Americans were greedy, selfish, focused only on individual profit. But here they were experiencing daily generosity from a nation that owed them nothing except basic human treatment under the Geneva Convention. One evening in mid-May, Werner Schmidt approached me after chow call. He was one of the youngest prisoners, barely 18, captured during the final push into Berlin when his unit had simply run out of ammunition and food. He stood at attention and saluted, something the prisoners weren't required to do but did out of respect and military courtesy. "Sergeant Morrison, sir, may I speak freely?" "Go ahead, son." Werner glanced around, gathering his courage for whatever he wanted to say. "Sir, I have been thinking about what I will tell my children someday if I live to have children. About this war, about America, about you and your soldiers." He paused, choosing his words carefully. His English had improved dramatically over the past month, partly from conversations with guards and partly from the English classes that some of the American chaplains had started offering. I will tell them that the Americans who captured me fed me ice cream every day. I will tell them that when we were starving, when we were eating grass and tree bark and whatever we could find in the rubble of our cities, you gave us abundance. I will tell them that you treated us better than our own officers treated us in the final months of the war. His words hit me harder than any artillery barrage I'd ever survived. Here was an enemy soldier, someone who'd been shooting at Americans just weeks before, someone whose unit had probably killed American boys, telling me that our kindness had changed his entire understanding of what America represented. But most importantly, sir, Werner continued, I will tell them that this is what it means to be truly strong, not the strength that comes from making others suffer, not the power that comes from taking everything for yourself, but the strength that allows you to be generous to your enemies. The breakthrough moment, the moment when everything changed, not just for these prisoners, but for my own understanding of what we were fighting for, came on May 8, 1945, VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. When news of Germany's unconditional surrender reached Camp Shelby, transmitted by radio from General Eisenhower's headquarters, I expected celebrations from the American staff, maybe some grief or resentment from the prisoners. What I witnessed was something entirely different, something that would stay with me for the rest of my life. Klaus Richter called all 1,200 prisoners to formation in the main compound yard, the same formation they'd maintained every morning for roll call since their arrival. They stood at perfect attention in neat ranks, their uniforms clean and pressed, their bearing dignified despite their status as prisoners of war. Klaus read the announcement first in German, his voice carrying across the compound in the evening stillness, then translated it into English for the benefit of the American guards who'd gathered to witness this historic moment. When he finished, there was complete silence for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 or 40 seconds. Then, spontaneously, without any signal or command, every single prisoner began singing. Not Die Wacht am Rhein or Deutschland über alles or any Nazi anthem, not even Das Deutschlandlied, their national anthem. They sang Lili Marleen, the song that every soldier on both sides of the war knew by heart, the song that had become the unofficial anthem of longing for home, for peace, for an end to the killing. Their voices rose over the Mississippi pines, 1,200 men singing in perfect harmony about a lamppost outside a barracks gate, about a soldier's sweetheart waiting for his return. As their voices rose and fell with the familiar melody, I saw American guards wiping tears from their eyes, saw tough MPs who'd fought across Europe standing at attention out of respect for the moment. When the song ended, the silence was profound. Then Klaus stepped forward, maintaining his military bearing, and approached me with a formality I'd never seen before, even from him. "Sergeant Morrison," he said, his voice carrying across the compound so every prisoner and guard could hear, "on behalf of all German prisoners at Camp Shelby, I wish to thank you and the American Army for showing us what honor truly means. You have treated us not as conquered enemies, but as fellow soldiers who happened to fight for the wrong side." He paused, and I could see him struggling with emotions he'd kept carefully controlled for months. "You have fed us when we were starving, clothed us when we were in rags, given us medical care when we were sick, and most importantly, you have shown us dignity when we deserved only contempt. You have treated us better than our own officers treated us in the final months of the war." The ice cream distribution that day was different from all the others. Instead of the usual quiet gratitude, there was something approaching celebration. Not celebration of German defeat, but celebration of the end of killing, of the beginning of peace, of the possibility that men could be human again. Men who'd been enemies of America just months before were now laughing, sharing stories, making plans for rebuilding their broken homeland. And through it all, they kept coming back to the same theme. If Americans could afford to give enemies ice cream every day, if they could treat prisoners with such dignity and generosity, what could they accomplish in peacetime? What kind of society produced such abundance and such generosity? Otto Brenner, the baker from Munich with the 7-year-old daughter, pulled me aside during the celebration. "Sergeant Morrison," he said, "I want to ask you something, and please, I hope you will give me an honest answer." "Go ahead, Otto. This ice cream, this food, the way you have treated us, is this normal for American soldiers? Or have we received special treatment because we are prisoners?" I thought about his question carefully, because I could see it was genuinely important to him. "Otto," You've been fed standard army rations, same food American soldiers get, same portions, same quality. The ice cream, well, we don't always have ice cream, but when we do, everyone gets some. Prisoners, guards, officers, everyone. He shook his head in amazement, running his hand through his graying hair. Sergeant, I was a baker before the war. I knew food, I understood what it cost to produce good meals. My unit was elite Wehrmacht, some of the best-fed troops in the German army. Even at our best, before the shortages, before the bombing, we never had food like this. He paused, looking out over the compound where his fellow prisoners were playing volleyball, writing letters home, and simply enjoying the evening without fear of air raids or artillery attacks. My daughter Greta, she has never tasted ice cream, never seen white bread except in pictures, never had meat more than once a month even before the war became desperate. And here, you feed prisoners, your enemies, better than German civilians have eaten in 3 years. No wonder you won the war. We were fighting a nation that could afford to be generous to its enemies. The final ice cream distribution came on June 15, 1945, the day before the last group of prisoners shipped out for repatriation back to Germany. Cookie Williams had outdone himself for this farewell ceremony. He'd managed to get not just vanilla, but chocolate ice cream, strawberry, and even some butter pecan that the supply sergeant had somehow procured from New Orleans. As I watched those men file through the line one last time, receiving their final taste of American abundance, I felt something I hadn't expected, genuine sadness that they were leaving. These men had become more than prisoners to me, more than former enemies. They'd become a window into the human cost of war, a daily reminder that the boys we'd been fighting were someone's sons, someone's fathers, someone's brothers. They'd shown me that underneath the field grey uniforms and the foreign language, they were soldiers just like us, caught up in something bigger than any individual could control. Klaus Richter was, as always, last in line. When Private Johnson handed him his final portion, a scoop of each flavor piled high in a metal bowl, Klaus stood there for a long moment, just looking at it like he was trying to memorize every detail. "Sergeant Morrison," he said, his English more careful and formal than usual, "I have something to tell you that I hope you will remember and perhaps share with others." I nodded, sensing this was important. When I return to Germany, when I see the ruins of my country and try to help rebuild what we have destroyed, I will spend the rest of my life telling people what I learned here. Not about American military might. We knew about that from the battlefield. We felt your bombers overhead, saw your tanks rolling through our cities, experienced the power of American industry and American determination. He took a spoonful of chocolate ice cream, closing his eyes for a moment as he savored it. But what I will tell them about is American character, about a people so strong, so confident in their way of life, that they can afford to be generous to their enemies. About soldiers who fed German prisoners ice cream every day, not because they had to, not because of any regulation or order, but because it was the right thing to do. He paused, looking directly at me with those pale blue eyes that had seen too much war, too much death, too much suffering. "My son Klaus, he is 8 years old if he survived the bombing of Hamburg. If he lives, if Germany survives, I will tell him about the American sergeant who fed his father ice cream every day, even though we had been trying to kill each other just weeks before. I will tell him that this is the America he should respect, the America he should try to understand and learn from." Klaus extended his hand and I shook it, the first time in 2 months that we'd touched as equals rather than as guard and prisoner. "That is the America I will teach him to admire, Sergeant Morrison. Not your bombs or your tanks, but your generosity, your ability to see enemies as human beings deserving of dignity and kindness." The last transport pulled out of Camp Shelby at 800 hours on June 16, 1945, a convoy of army trucks that would take them to the docks at New Orleans, then to Liberty ships bound for Hamburg, and the long journey home to a Germany that had been utterly transformed by defeat. As I watched those 1,200 German soldiers board the trucks, carrying their few possessions and the memories of their time in Mississippi, I thought about what we'd accomplished in those 2 months. We hadn't just fed prisoners according to the Geneva Convention. We hadn't just maintained order and discipline in a POW camp. We'd shown them the true face of America. Not the America of propaganda posters or political speeches, but the America of daily kindness, of shared meals, of ice cream on hot afternoons. These men were going home to a destroyed country, to cities reduced to rubble, to families scattered and broken by 6 years of war. But they were carrying with them something more valuable than any physical possession: the memory of American generosity, the understanding that strength didn't have to mean cruelty, that victory didn't require revenge. Many of them would become the foundation of the democratic West Germany that rose from the ashes of the Reich. They'd help build the Marshall Plan reconstruction, support NATO membership, and create the German-American alliance that continues today. And some small part of that transformation began with ice cream served by American GIs in a Mississippi POW camp. 6 months later, I received the first of what would become dozens of letters forwarded through the Red Cross and various veteran organizations. This one was from Klaus Richter, postmarked Hamburg, written on paper so thin you could see through it. Dear Sergeant Morrison, I am home now, or what remains of home. Hamburg is destroyed. 75% of the city is rubble and ruin. My apartment building no longer exists. My wife and son are alive by God's grace, living in the basement of what used to be a school. The work of rebuilding is hard, the food is still scarce, but I carry with me every day the memory of those Mississippi afternoons and the taste of American ice cream. More importantly, I carry the memory of American kindness, American generosity, American strength that shows itself through compassion rather than cruelty. I have told everyone I meet about the American soldiers who treated German prisoners with such dignity. Many do not believe me. They cannot imagine that victorious soldiers would share their luxuries with defeated enemies. But I keep telling the story because it is true and because it shows them what America really represents. My wife asks me to describe America to her, to help her understand the country that defeated us, but then treated us with such humanity. I tell her about a place so wealthy, so confident, so secure in its values, that its soldiers can give ice cream to their enemies without fear, without anger, without reservation. She thinks I am creating fairy tales, but I know what I experienced. I tasted American abundance every day for 2 months. I experienced American kindness from soldiers who had every reason to hate us. I learned that true strength comes not from the ability to destroy your enemies, but from the wisdom to transform them into friends. Thank you, Sergeant, for showing me what America truly represents. If our countries are ever friends again, and I pray that they will be, it will be because of men like you who chose kindness over revenge, generosity over cruelty, hope over hatred. Your grateful former prisoner, Klaus Richter, P.S. My son Klaus asks me every day about the American sergeant who gave his father ice cream. I have told him that if he studies hard, learns English, and grows up to be an honorable man, perhaps someday he will visit America and taste ice cream in the country that taught his father about mercy. That letter sits in my desk drawer to this day, along with 47 others that arrived over the following years. Letters from Hans Kruger, who became a teacher and taught his students about American democracy. Letters from Wilhelm Hoffmann, who became a translator and helped negotiate trade agreements between Germany and America. Letters from Otto Brenner, who reopened his bakery in Munich and named one of his specialties American ice cream cake in honor of his time at Camp Shelby. Every time I read those letters, I'm reminded of something our generals and politicians never taught us in training. The most important battles aren't always fought with tanks and rifles and artillery barrages. Sometimes they're fought with simple acts of human decency, like giving a starving enemy soldier a scoop of ice cream on a hot Mississippi afternoon. Those 2 months at Camp Shelby taught me something that would shape the rest of my life. America's greatest weapon isn't our military might, our industrial capacity, or our technological superiority. It's our ability to transform enemies into friends through the simple power of abundance and generosity. Those 1,200 German soldiers went home with full bellies and changed hearts, and many of them became the foundation of the democratic West Germany that stands as our strongest ally in Europe today. The ice cream we served wasn't just dessert, it was diplomacy. Every scoop was a small investment in peace, every bowl a tiny down payment on a future where German and American soldiers would fight side by side instead of against each other. We didn't know it at the time, but we were helping to build the post-war world, one spoonful of vanilla ice cream at a time. Looking back now, 78 years later, I realized that those prisoners taught me as much as we taught them. They showed me the true cost of war, not just in blood and bullets, but in simple human pleasures lost in children who'd never tasted ice cream, In families torn apart by ideology and nationalism, and the madness that grips nations when they convince themselves that some people are less human than others. But they also showed me the power of redemption, the possibility that even the deepest hatreds can be healed by consistent acts of kindness. Every day that we served ice cream to those German soldiers, we were proving that Americans could be better than our enemies expected, more generous than our propaganda claimed, more human than war usually allows. That moment on April 15, 1945, when Klaus Richter took his first spoonful of American ice cream and broke down crying, changed everything for me. I saw in his tears not the defeat of an enemy, but the recognition of our common humanity. I understood that the young German farm boy eating ice cream with wonder and gratitude was no different from the American farm boys I'd served with, who died in French hedgerows and Belgian forests fighting for freedom. The war was ending, but the real victory wasn't on the battlefield. It was in that mess hall, in those moments when former enemies recognized each other as human beings, deserving of dignity and respect. It was in the transformation of 1,200 hostile prisoners into 1,200 grateful men who would spend the rest of their lives telling their children and grandchildren about American generosity. I served another 6 months in the army after Camp Shelby closed, mostly processing discharge papers and helping other veterans transition back to civilian life. But I never forgot those German prisoners, never stopped thinking about the lessons we'd learned together during those hot Mississippi afternoons. When I finally came home to Mississippi in December 1945, I brought with me a new understanding of what it meant to be an American. It wasn't just about the freedoms we enjoyed or the prosperity we'd built. It was about our responsibility to use that freedom and prosperity wisely, generously, with compassion for those who had less. I opened a small restaurant in Jackson, Mississippi in 1947, and for 30 years, I made sure we always had ice cream on the menu. Not because it was profitable, Mississippi already had plenty of ice cream parlors, but because I wanted to honor the memory of those German soldiers who taught me that simple pleasures could be instruments of peace. Every time a child ordered ice cream at my restaurant, every time I scooped vanilla into a cone or bowl, I thought about Hans Kruger and Wilhelm Hoffmann and Klaus Richter and all the rest. I thought about their children, growing up in a rebuilt Germany, learning about America not from textbooks or propaganda, but from their fathers' stories about Mississippi afternoons and the American soldiers who shared their ice cream with former enemies. This was the story of Sergeant First Class Frank "Tank" Morrison, 3rd Armored Division, who witnessed how simple daily acts of kindness could reshape the hearts and minds of 1,200 former enemies. His account, documented in his personal journals, preserved in Camp Shelby records, and confirmed by dozens of letters from grateful German prisoners, reminds us that history's most important moments aren't always the famous battles or political decisions. Sometimes they're found in the quiet power of shared ice cream on a Mississippi afternoon. Morrison's experience was typical of thousands of similar stories from POW camps across America during and after World War II, representing our nation's commitment to treating even our enemies with dignity and respect under the Geneva Convention. These small acts of humanity helped lay the foundation for the post-war alliance between America and West Germany that proved crucial during the Cold War and continues today. Frank Morrison's story demonstrates that American strength has always come not from our ability to destroy our enemies, but from our capacity to transform them into allies through generosity, abundance, and simple human decency. The German prisoners who returned home with memories of daily ice cream became ambassadors for American values, helping to build the democratic institutions that made West Germany one of our most reliable partners in the defense of freedom. What struck you most about Frank's story? Have you heard similar accounts from veterans in your own family? These personal stories help us understand not just what happened during those crucial years, but how it felt to live through history as it was being made, one act of kindness at a time. If you want to hear more first-hand accounts like this one, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Tomorrow we'll be sharing the story of Navy Corpsman Jimmy "Doc" Patterson, who treated wounded Japanese soldiers on Okinawa and discovered something about honor and sacrifice that changed his understanding of what it means to be human in the midst of war. These voices from the past deserve to be heard. Let's make sure their stories live on.